Hey everyone, welcome back. Ready for another deep dive. This time, we're tackling a topic that's been generating a lot of buzz lately, moving to Canada from the US.
It seems like everyone's dreaming of heading north these days.
Yeah, it's definitely a hot topic, and for good reason. But let's be real, it's not as simple as packing a suitcase and hopping across the border, right?
Not quite. Canada's immigration system is pretty complex, and frankly, it's gotten even tougher to crack in recent years.
Okay, so maybe not a spur of the moment kind of move, but if someone's serious about making Canada their new home, where do they even begin?
Well, the Holy Grail is permanent residency.
That's the golden ticket, right? The ability to live and work in Canada indefinitely.
Exactly. And for most skilled workers, the main pathway is called express entry.
I've heard that name thrown around, but what does it actually mean?
Think of it like this. You're applying for a job, but instead of just submitting your resume, you're competing with hundreds of others based on a point system.
So it's like a giant talent competition, but for immigration.
You got it. Your age, education, work experience, language skills, it all factors into your score. And here's the kicker. Canadian experience gives you a huge advantage.
Ah, so those already in Canada racking up points for Canadian education and work.
Exactly. Hundreds of thousands of people are already there, building their profiles. It makes it super competitive for those coming in from the U.S. with no Canadian ties.
Okay, that makes sense. But what about those provincial nominee programs? Don't they offer kind of a back door into Canada?
They do. Each province has its own program, and they can nominate individuals they think would thrive in their region.
So it's like a province saying, hey, we need nurses, come on in.
Exactly. It can be a great option, but even these programs have become more limited recently.
Okay. So maybe not the easiest route either. So it sounds like becoming a permanent resident right away. It's a tough one for most Americans. What if you just want to, I don't know, test the waters first? Get a feel for Canadian life. Isn't that where work permits come in?
Absolutely. Work permits are your temporary key to Canada. And for Americans, there's a bit of a secret weapon. The Canada-United States-Mexico Agreement, or CUSMA.
CUSMA. That rings a bell. Isn't that the thing that replaced NAFTA?
You got it. And it has this awesome provision that lets U.S. citizens in certain professions get work permits faster, often without this thing called a labor market impact assessment.
Hold on. A what assessment?
It's basically a test Canadian employers usually have to go through to prove they couldn't find a Canadian to do the job.
Oh, so it's like, sorry, no Canadians available, got to bring someone in from the US.
Right. But with CUSMA, certain American professionals can bypass that whole process, which is a huge time and money saver for employers.
Okay, so CUSMA makes things easier, but what's the catch? What kind of work permit are we talking about here?
We're talking about a 3-year work permit.
Wow, 3 years. That's not just a quick visit, that's like a real chance to settle in and experience Canada.
Exactly. Plenty of time to get a feel for life there, maybe even start building up those Canadian experience points for permanent residency down the line.
Okay, so that sounds pretty amazing. But what about the jobs themselves? What kind of professions qualify for this CSMA fast track?
That's the best part. 63 professions are eligible.
63, that's a pretty big list.
It is. Everything from accountants and architects to, get this, zoologists.
Zoologist. Now that's specific, so it's not just your typical tech jobs or business roles. There's some real variety there.
Absolutely. And that's what makes this pathway so exciting. It opens doors for people with all sorts of skills and backgrounds.
Okay, you've definitely piqued my curiosity. We'll have to dive into those CUSMA professions in more detail later. But what about Americans whose jobs aren't on that list? Are they just out of luck?
Not at all. There are still other work permit options. There's the Temporary Foreign Worker Program and the International Mobility Program, but those usually require that labor market impact assessment we talked about.
Right, the Prove No Canadians Available test.
Yep, that's the one. But there's also the Global Talent Stream.
The what stream?
It's basically a fast-track LMIA process for high-demand fields like IT and engineering.
So if you've got the skills Canada needs, they'll make it easier for you to come in.
Exactly. And get this, with Global Talent Stream, you could potentially have your work permit approved in just 2 weeks.
2 weeks. That's faster than ordering something online these days.
It is. They're really serious about attracting top talent in those in-demand fields.
Okay, so we've got CUSMA, the Temporary Foreign Worker Program, the International Mobility Program, and this Global Talent Stream. Anything else we're missing?
Well, there's one more that's specifically geared toward younger Americans. International Experience Canada, or IEC, and the working holiday category is a great option.
A working holiday. That sounds like a fun way to experience Canada without the pressure of a full-time job.
Exactly. It lets you work and travel in Canada for up to a year.
So it's like a gap year for adults.
You could say that. It's a fantastic opportunity for people under 35 to try out different cities, explore the country, and maybe even figure out where they'd like to settle down long term.
Sounds amazing, but is there a catch?
Well, IEC has limited spots available. You have to apply early,
So it's first come, first served.
pretty much. So if you're thinking about a working holiday, don't wait until the last minute.
Good advice. Plan ahead. Speaking of planning ahead, let's shift gears a bit. What about those who find love north of the border? If you're dating or married to a Canadian, does that open up any special pathways?
You bet it does. Spousal sponsorship is a fantastic option for folks in that situation.
So you're telling me love can conquer the Canadian immigration system?
It definitely can. But there are some rules, of course. You need to have a Canadian citizen or permanent resident as your spouse or common law partner, and the relationship has to be genuine.
So no marrying just for a visa?
Definitely not. Canadian authorities are pretty strict about that. You need to have real evidence of a genuine relationship. Think love letters, photos, shared expenses.
The real deal, basically.
Absolutely. You're building a life together, not just ticking a box on an immigration form. And there are two ways to go about sponsorship. There's sponsorship from within Canada and sponsorship from outside Canada.
So if my partner's still living in the U.S. with me, we could actually start the process now.
Exactly. You don't have to wait until you're both living in Canada.
That's convenient. But let's be real, I imagine this whole sponsorship thing can get pretty complicated. What are some things people should be aware of?
Well, one of the biggest benefits is that sponsored spouses can get an open work permit while waiting for their permanent residency to be finalized.
Okay, I've heard of open work permits. What does that mean exactly?
It means you're not tied to a specific employer. You can work for anyone in Canada, which gives you a lot of flexibility.
Wow, that's awesome. So even if you're not in a CCUS MA profession, you could still come to Canada and start working right away if you're sponsored by your spouse.
Exactly. But it's important to remember that even with spousal sponsorship, there are potential pitfalls. The application process can be tricky, and you need to be meticulous and organized.
So maybe a good idea to get some expert help to navigate all the paperwork and deadlines.
It can't hurt. There are immigration consultants and lawyers who specialize in spousal sponsorship, and their guidance can be invaluable.
All right, so we've covered the basics of permanent residency, the ins and outs of work permits, and even explored this love route of spousal sponsorship. Whew! That's a lot of information. But let's be honest, moving to another country is about more than just visas and paperwork, right? What about the nitty-gritty of daily life in Canada?
You're absolutely right. Moving to a new country is a huge life decision.
Mhm.
It's essential to go in with a realistic understanding of what to expect.
Totally. And I think a lot of people have this romanticized view of Canada, especially when it comes to healthcare. Everyone talks about free healthcare in Canada, but what's the reality?
Well, healthcare is publicly funded in Canada, that's true. But it's not always as simple as it sounds.
Like what are some things people should be prepared for?
Well, finding a family doctor can be a real challenge. There's a shortage of physicians, and wait lists can be long, especially in certain areas.
So you might not have a doctor right away. That's definitely something to consider.
It is, and it's not just about finding a doctor. There can be long wait times for specialists and certain procedures, and not everything is covered by public health care.
Wait, not everything. I thought healthcare in Canada was, well, free.
It covers a lot, but not everything. Things like dental care, vision care, and some prescription drugs might require private insurance.
So there might be extra costs to consider on top of the public system.
It's something to factor in, especially if you have pre-existing conditions or need regular dental or vision care.
Okay, starting to sound a little less free than I initially thought. What about the cost of living in general? Is it comparable to the U.S.?
It really depends on where you live, just like in the U.S. Big cities like Toronto and Vancouver are expensive, especially housing. But there are other cities and towns that are way more affordable.
So the classic trade-off. Big city excitement versus smaller town budget friendliness.
Exactly. It's all about finding the right fit for your lifestyle and your wallet.
All right, so healthcare access can be tricky. The cost of living can vary wildly. Anything else people should be aware of before they start packing their bags?
Well, taxes are another factor.
Mhm.
Canadians pay both federal and provincial income taxes, plus a sales tax called a GST.
Right, the joys of taxes. They follow you wherever you go.
They do. And each province has its own tax rates and rules, so it's worth doing your homework to understand the specifics.
So it's not just about moving to Canada, it's about choosing the right province, too.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay, we've covered some of the maybe less glamorous aspects of Canadian life, but let's not forget the good stuff. What are some of the things that make Canada such a draw for Americans?
Oh, there are so many. Stunning natural beauty, vibrant cities, a diverse culture, and a generally high quality of life.
And I've heard the people are pretty awesome too.
It's true. Canadians are generally known for being friendly and welcoming, so there's a lot to love about Canada. But it's crucial to go in with a realistic understanding of both the challenges and the rewards.
Exactly. Informed decisions lead to smoother transitions.
Okay, folks, we've covered a ton of ground in this first part of our deep dive. We've talked about permanent residency pathways, the different types of work permits available, and even explored the romantic route of spousal sponsorship.
It's been a whirlwind tour of the Canadian immigration landscape. But there's so much more to unpack.
We haven't even scratched the surface of those 63 CUSMA professions, and we still need to delve deeper into the specifics of actually obtaining a work permit.
And there are so many other fascinating aspects of life in Canada to discover.
You're right, so much more to explore. We'll be back in part 2 of this deep dive to dig into those CUSMA professions and uncover even more insights into making your Canadian dream a reality. Stay tuned.
Welcome back to our deep dive on moving to Canada from the U.S.
All right, so last time we left off with that mysterious list of 63 professions that qualify for a fast-track work permit under CUSMA, like a secret menu for Canadian immigration.
It really is. And it's way more diverse than most people realize.
Okay, I'm dying to know. Give us some examples. What kind of jobs are we talking about here?
Well, you've got your usual suspects. Engineers, accountants, lawyers, those are always in demand.
Right, the classic high-skilled professions.
But then you get into some really interesting territory, like landscape architects.
Landscape architects. Okay, that's not one I would have guessed.
Right. Or how about librarians? Or even music therapists?
Music therapists. Now, that's unexpected.
It's such a cool mix. It's not just STEM fields. There's a real range of talents and expertise represented.
So it's about more than just filling immediate labor gaps. It's about attracting a diverse group of people to contribute to Canadian society.
Exactly. And remember, this is just the first step. Once you're in Canada working under CUSMA, you can start building that all-important Canadian experience.
Right, those points that can help you qualify for permanent residency later on.
Exactly. It's like a try before you buy kind of situation. See if Canada is really the right fit for you.
Okay, so let's say someone's listening and thinking, hey, my job's on that list. What's next? How do they actually snag that CUSMA work permit?
Well, the first hurdle is getting a job offer from a Canadian employer.
Right, so you can't just stroll into Canada and demand a work permit. You actually need someone to want to hire you.
Exactly. You still got to go through the whole job search process. But the good news is that Canadian employers don't have to jump through hoops to hire you if you're eligible under CUSMA.
Because they don't need that labor market impact assessment.
Exactly. No need to prove they couldn't find a Canadian to do the job.
Right.
So it's a faster, smoother process for everyone involved.
Okay, so it streamlines things. That makes sense. So if you're serious about moving to Canada, step 1 is polishing up that resume and starting your job hunt.
Exactly. Make those connections. Network. Reach out to companies in your field. You never know what might come of it.
All right, so we've talked about skilled workers, but what about the entrepreneurial types out there? Can Americans start businesses in Canada? What if they've got the next big idea brewing?
Absolutely. Canada loves entrepreneurs. There are a few pathways for business immigration.
Okay, tell me more.
Well, there's the Startup Visa program, which is specifically for innovative entrepreneurs with promising business ideas.
So if you've got something groundbreaking, Canada's basically saying, come and make it happen here.
Exactly. And there are also provincial nominee programs that have streams specifically for entrepreneurs.
So it's worth exploring those options too.
Definitely. Each province has its own criteria and priorities, so do your homework and see what aligns best with your business goals.
Okay, starting a business is on the table. What about, say, buying property? Can Americans own homes in Canada?
The dream of a Canadian cottage. Well, that's where things get a little tricky.
Tricky how?
Up until recently, it was pretty straightforward for foreigners to buy property in Canada. But things have changed.
What do you mean?
Canada's implemented some restrictions on foreign buyers purchasing residential property.
Restrictions? Like what?
Well, there's a temporary ban in place right now.
A ban? Whoa, that's serious. So Americans can't buy a house in Canada at all?
Well, there are some exceptions. If you have a valid work permit or are an international student who meets certain requirements, you might still be eligible.
But for the average American looking to buy a vacation home or an investment property, it's a no-go for now.
Exactly. It's a big change, and it just highlights how important it is to stay up to date on Canadian policies. Things can shift quickly.
Okay, so information is key. Always double-check the latest rules before you make any big decisions.
Absolutely. Speaking of changing landscapes, I think it's worth touching on the overall vibe in Canada towards Americans these days.
Yeah, that's a good point. I know there's been a lot of talk about immigration and its impact on Canadian society. What's the general sentiment?
Well, Canada has always prided itself on being welcoming and inclusive, and that hasn't changed. But there's definitely a growing awareness of the pressures that immigration can bring.
Pressures like what?
Things like strain on the healthcare system, rising housing costs, competition for jobs.
So it's not all sunshine and rainbows, even in the land of maple syrup.
Not exactly.
Yeah.
While Canadians are generally very open and friendly, there's also a sense that the country needs to find a balance when it comes to immigration.
A balance between welcoming newcomers and ensuring the well-being of current residents.
Precisely. It's a complex issue, and there's no easy answer.
Yeah.
But it's something to be aware of when considering a move to Canada.
Right. It's about having realistic expectations, understanding the complexities, and being prepared for the challenges, just like you would when moving to any new place.
Exactly. Informed expectations make for a smoother transition.
Okay, so let's wrap this up with some advice for our listeners who are seriously considering making the move. What's the one thing you want them to take away from this conversation?
Do your research. Don't rely on rumors or outdated information. Immigration policies change constantly, so stay up to date.
So where should people go for reliable information? Give us the inside scoop.
The official Canadian government website is a great starting point, specifically Immigration, Refugees, and Citizenship Canada, or IRCC.
Got it. IRCC. What else?
Reputable immigration consultants and lawyers can also provide invaluable guidance, but be wary of anyone promising guaranteed results or charging crazy fees.
Yeah, if it sounds too good to be true, it probably is.
Exactly. Trust your gut, do your due diligence, and make sure you're getting advice from a legitimate source.
Okay, great advice. So we've covered a lot of ground. Those COSMA professions, business immigration, even the realities of healthcare and cost of living. We've tried to provide a balanced picture, both the exciting opportunities and the potential challenges.
Because moving to a new country is a big decision, and it's important to go in with your eyes wide open.
But there's one crucial element we haven't touched on yet, the emotional side of this whole experience.
Ah, yes. The human side of immigration.
It's not just about visas and logistics. It's about leaving behind familiarity, friends, family, and starting over in a new place.
And that can be both exhilarating and terrifying at the same time.
Exactly. And building a new life in a different culture takes time and effort. It's a process, and it's okay to feel all the feels along the way.
Absolutely. Embrace the excitement, the uncertainty, maybe even a little homesickness. It's all part of the journey.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of practical advice, but we also want to leave you with something to ponder, something to spark your imagination.
Imagine for a moment, if you could work remotely from anywhere in Canada, where would you choose and why?
That's such a great question to think about. Would it be a bustling city, a charming small town, a secluded spot surrounded by nature? What calls to you?
What kind of lifestyle do you envision for yourself in Canada? What are your priorities?
Let those questions guide your exploration. Canada is a vast and diverse country with something to offer everyone. So dream big and see where your imagination takes you.
Exactly. And we'll be back in part 3 of this deep dive to tackle the nitty-gritty of actually making the move. Things like finances, driving, healthcare.
All the practical stuff you need to know to make this dream a reality. Stay tuned.
Welcome back to the deep dive. We've covered a lot of ground in this series about moving to Canada from the U.S., but today we're getting down to brass tacks, the practical stuff, the things you don't necessarily think about when you're daydreaming about mountains and maple syrup.
Exactly. Because let's be real, moving to another country, it's not just about the big picture, it's about navigating all those little details that can make or break the experience.
Totally. And that's what we're tackling today. So let's start with the big one, money. How does my American bank account magically transform into Canadian dollars? What about investments, retirement accounts, help?
Well, it's not exactly magic, unfortunately. Transferring savings, investments, and even just wrapping your head around the Canadian banking system, it's a whole thing. You'll want to plan ahead.
Okay, so Not something to figure out after you've already landed in Toronto with a suitcase full of US dollars. Definitely not. This is where a cross-border financial advisor comes in handy.
Ah, so this is a call in the experts kind of situation.
Exactly. Think of it like this. You wouldn't try to perform surgery on yourself. You'd go to a professional. This is no different. You need someone who understands both the US and Canadian systems to guide you through those financial transitions.
Makes sense. All right, next up on my list of practical questions, driving. Can I just waltz into the Canadian DMV, slap down my US driver's license, and walk out with a shiny new Canadian one?
If only it were that simple. Driving in Canada can be a bit of a puzzle, and the rules can actually vary quite a bit depending on which province you're in.
So no one-size-fits-all answer. Typical Canada, always keeping things interesting.
Exactly. Some provinces might let you swap licenses for a limited time, but others might require you to take written tests, practical tests, the whole 9 yards.
Wait, so all those years of perfect driving in the US don't count for anything?
Well, in some provinces they do. Some have reciprocal agreements with the US where they actually look at your driving record.
So that speeding ticket I got back in college could come back to bite me in Canada.
It's possible. So yeah, do your research, figure out what the rules are in your specific province before you even think about packing up the car.
Noted. Driving in Canada requires its own deep dive. Okay, last big one on my list, healthcare. We've already talked about the access issues, the potential for long wait times to find a doctor, but what about the coverage itself? If I land in Canada on a work permit, am I covered by the Canadian healthcare system right away, or is there a waiting period?
Patience is key here. Most provinces have a waiting period, usually about 3 months, before you're eligible for their public health insurance.
So I shouldn't cancel my US health insurance the second I cross the border?
Probably not a good idea.
Yeah,
You'll want to bridge that gap with some private insurance until you qualify for the provincial plan.
makes sense. So it's kind of like a transition period.
Exactly. And even once you're on the public system, it's important to remember that it doesn't cover everything. You might need supplemental insurance for things like dental, vision, some prescription drugs.
Okay, so yet another cost to factor in. All right, it seems like the overarching theme here is plan, plan, plan. Finances, driving, healthcare. Nothing about moving to another country is as straightforward as it might seem from a distance.
You got it. Enthusiasm is awesome, but a healthy dose of preparation is essential too.
Totally. Canada isn't this magical utopia where everything's perfect. It's a real country with its own unique set of challenges, just like anywhere else.
Exactly. And understanding those realities is part of making a successful transition.
But even with the challenges, Canada offers so much. The incredible natural beauty, the welcoming culture, the high quality of life. It's no wonder so many people are drawn to it.
Absolutely. And even if you're not ready for a permanent move just yet, there are so many ways to experience Canada temporarily.
Like those working holidays we talked about.
Yep. Or student visas, or even a temporary work permit through CUSMA. All fantastic ways to dip your toes in the Canadian waters before diving in head first.
I love that analogy. All right, folks, that brings us to the end of our deep dive into moving to Canada from the U.S.
We hope this series has been helpful, insightful, and maybe even a little inspiring.
We've covered a lot of ground, the different immigration pathways, the practical considerations, the realities of Canadian life. But most importantly, we want to encourage you to keep exploring, do your research, ask questions, and most importantly, don't be afraid to chase your dreams.
Because whether you decide to make Canada your new home or simply add it to your list of adventures, the journey itself is full of incredible opportunities for growth, discovery, and maybe even a few delicious poutine stops along the way.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Thanks for joining us on the deep dive, and until next time, happy exploring.